Okay, so hello and welcome back. Now in this video what we will do is we will talk about essentially the multiplication table for 4. So far essentially what we have done is that we have essentially done the multiplication of 2, 3, 5 and 10, and of course we need these multiplication tables essentially for all the numbers, meaning for 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 and well, of course 10 we have already done, but it's not really necessary because well, 10 times 1 is 10, 10 times 2 is 20, 10 times 3 is equal to 30, 40, 50, 60, and so you don't really need to, I'm making the assumption that you already know essentially all the multiplication for essentially for 10, which is essentially 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, so, but we have already done that. Now, we have done the multiplication for 2 and 3 and 5 and 10. So now let's talk a little bit about the multiplication for 4. Now, the multiplication for 4 is nothing but is essentially, if I have 4 groups of 1, if I have 4, so suppose that essentially this is one group, another group, another group, another group. I have essentially 4 groups of 1, 4 groups of 1, which is essentially, if I want to find essentially the total number of objects here, I would have essentially 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1, meaning 1 for the first group, 1 for the second group, 1 for the third group, and 1 for the fourth group, which is equal to 4. And 4 groups of 1 would be 4 times 1, which is equal to 4, right? Now, if I had essentially, if I had 4 groups of 2, I would have a 2 here, another 2, another 2, and another 2. So then we have essentially 4 groups of, we would have essentially 4 groups of 2. 4 groups of 2, which is essentially the total number of objects would be 2 plus a 2 plus a 2 plus a 2 4 times, which is nothing but 4 times 2. Now this is equal to 8, and so this is equal to 8, right? And so then the multiplication table for 4 would be essentially 4 times 1 is equal to 4, 4 times 2 is equal to 8, 4 times 3 is equal to 12, and 4 times 4 is equal to 16, 4 times 5 is equal to 20, 4 times 6 is equal to 24, 4 times 7 is equal to 28, and then 4 times 8 is equal to 32, 4 times 9 is equal to 36, and 4 times 10 is equal to 40, right? So that's the multiplication table for 4. And you can see that since it's a multiplication table for 4, then essentially all the sums that you get here, the difference between consecutive sums, meaning consecutive, these are essentially consecutive means come one after the other. So for example, 4 and 8 are 2 consecutive sums, 8 and 12 are 2 consecutive sums, 12 and 16 are 2 consecutive sums, right? But then 4 and 12 are not 2 consecutive sums, or 12 or 20 are not 2 consecutive sums. They have to be essentially put together, or essentially one of them has to come exactly after the other one. Now the difference between any 2 consecutive sums is always 4, because it's a multiplication table of 4, meaning 4 plus 4 is equal to 8, 8 plus 4 is equal to 12, 12 plus 4 is equal to 16, 16 plus 4 is equal to 20, and so on and so forth, right? Now there is also a relationship between the multiplication of 2 and 4, right? Now and what that is actually the following. So if I write down essentially the multiplication table for 2, I will have essentially the multiplication table of 2. What we will have is essentially this table over here, which is essentially 2 times 1 is equal to 2, 2 times 2 is equal to 4, 2 times 3 is equal to 6, 2 times 4 is equal to 8, and so on and so forth. Okay? So this is the multiplication table of basically 2. Now if you take a look at the multiplication table of 4, what you will have is that essentially you will have 4 times 1 is equal to 4, 4 times 2 is equal to 8, and 4 times 3 is equal to 12, and 4 times 4 is equal to 16, and so on and so forth, right? Now you see these sums over here, 2 and 4, 4 and 8, 6 and 12, 8 and 16, right? So it's always essentially, if you take this number and multiply it by 2, you will get this number. So 2 times 2 is equal to 4, 4 times 2 is equal to 8, 6 times 2 is equal to 12, 8 times 2 is equal to 16, and so on and so forth, right? And also you notice that essentially 2 and essentially the relationship between 2 and 4, meaning 2 times 2 is actually equal to 4, right? So essentially this number is twice this number, and all of these numbers are twice these numbers, right? And the reason why that happens is actually simple, meaning that basically you have, if I say for example 2 times 1, 2 times 1 would be nothing but essentially 2 groups of 1. Now if I say 4 times 1, that's essentially 4 groups of 1, right? If I say for example 2 times 2, if I say essentially 2 times 2 would be 2 groups of 2, and 4 times 2 would be 4 groups of 2, right? So that means that essentially now you can see that essentially the number of objects essentially in each group, in both the cases, the number of objects are always the same, right? The number of objects are the same. Again, we have one object in each group, one object in each group, and then again over here we have 2 objects in each group, again 2 objects in each group. So the number of objects in all the groups are essentially always the same, right? But then the number of groups are always the number of group over here is always twice the number of groups over here, right? If you have 2 groups over here, you have 4 groups over here. If you have 2 groups over here, you have 4 groups over here. So that essentially means that then the total number of groups over here is always going to be twice the total number of objects in these 2 groups. Again, the total number of objects in these groups over here is going to be twice the total number of objects in these groups, so simply because essentially you're doubling the number of groups over here. The number of objects remains the same, but then essentially since we are doubling the number of groups, then basically the total number of objects is going to be multiplied by 2, right? And that essentially explains the fact that essentially all the sums that you get here, when you multiply them by 2, you'll get essentially each and every sum over here, meaning 2 times 2 is equal to 4, 4 times 2 is equal to 8, 6 times 2 is equal to 12, 8 times 2 is equal to 16. And this also would explain, for example, the relationship between the multiplication table of 3 and 6, for example, right? Now, we have not done the multiplication for 6 yet, but if we actually do a couple of those things, we can see that the same essentially relationship exists there as well. So let's do the multiplication 3 and 6. And so if we did so, we have essentially 3 times 1 is equal to 3, 3 times 2 is equal to 6, 3 times 3 is equal to 9, 3 times 4 is equal to 12, and so on and so forth, right? Now 6 times 1 is equal to 6, 6 times 2 is equal to 12, 6 times 3 is equal to 18. 6 times 4 is equal to 24, and again the same relationship, meaning 3 and 6. 3 times 2 is equal to 6, because 3 times 2 is actually meaning that 6 is actually twice 3, right? So all the sums that you get here, if you multiply them by 2, you will get essentially these sums over here, the respective sums. So 3 times 2 is equal to 6, 6 times 2 is equal to 12, 9 times 2 is equal to 18, 12 times 2 is equal to 24, and so on and so forth, right? So that's basically that. And so in the next video we will basically do the multiplication tables for some other numbers, like for example 5 and 6 and so on and so forth. And I will see you in the next video. Thank you.